Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the many news items we have for you this week, the first is the juncture of anti-abortion laws, keeping patients alive, and the various ethical implications of these particular issues. A study on just where it is that gout comes from and claims it's not what we think. Yellow fever is surging, and this is not good news. Psychology research challenges the idea that attraction to breasts is not at all related to what you might think. Is it better to shower in the morning or the evening? Bird flu cases are surging in cats, and this is a second possible source of pandemic for us. Engineering bacteria so that they make crops and the soil grow in different ways. How it is that lightning will generate gamma rays. A study looking at the ability to create life on Earth much quicker than thought, and other news items that can be found in the timestamps given below. We'll start with the ethical quagmire that is the woman in Georgia who's being kept alive, effectively by force, despite being brain dead, so that the fetus she's carrying can be born, due to abortion ban laws. Now, strictly speaking, this is a very, let's say, complicated issue. Firstly, because the individual in question is brain dead. There is no coming back from that. At this point in time, they are so far dead that the only thing keeping them alive is basically the pure and intentional intervention of doctors and very, very dedicated intention and dedication to doing so. The reason for this is that the hospital is basically afraid that it's going to get in trouble because it could be construed as an abortion, since they're now carrying, at this time, a 21-week-old baby. At the time that the, let's say, problem first started, the baby was basically 12 weeks, and Georgia's ban starts from 6 weeks. So you can see why the hospital's, let's say, stuck in the middle of this very awkward situation. Strictly speaking, they can't change the law, they have to follow it. If for no other reason, then that's the only way they can continue to provide health services to other people. And unfortunately, that means they have to do something that is arguably unethical and also arguably immoral. But for one major element to all of this, the family itself has not said that they wouldn't have chosen to keep the woman alive in order to get the baby in the end. They've not said that. What they've taken issue with is that they weren't given a choice in the matter, which, choice of wording, ironically enough, may be a little bit controversial given that the whole choice is the fundamental argument for most, let's say, pro-abortion arguments, and, well, anti-choice is generally the contrary. So, yeah. This is going to unfortunately drag out for considerably longer, because they have to wait until the baby is 32 weeks before it's considered viable on its own. Now, depending on exact circumstances, this can be as early as 26 weeks, but 32 weeks is generally considered the safe lower limit. At 26 weeks, and there are all kinds of other complications that you'd really... This is one of those situations where it really sucks to be the hospital, because no matter what they do, they are the bad guys. And unfortunately, no matter what the family wants, to some extent, they don't really get a say in the matter. And of course, the mother has no say because, well, if they said anything, they'd neither be brain dead nor need life support. They'd possibly be a zombie. Next we have the use of actual treatment in hospitals that is useful, and it's a CRISPR treatment that's being trialled in a human in order to provide, well, basically a new gene for all intents and purposes, or at least a functioning gene. Now, it's not the first time the CRISPR has been used, but it is the first time that's been used in this particular scenario. What they're trying to do is treat chronic granulomatous disease. It's basically a disease where a whole bunch of immune cells, mostly neutrophils, cause all sorts of issues by not being able to function. And the neutrophils are basically turned off, which isn't good because they are one of the major leukocytes that provide defense in very broad terms. We say that as in, they are your first line of defense and they are not your adaptive, but instead your innate immune system. The innate immune system isn't specialized, but it does everything okay. Therefore, having one leg of it chopped off means it's likely to fall over. Catch with this, as with just about every news item we mention, is that it's yet to actually have its final results. it will take between 6 and 12 months to be sure that the stem cells that have been provided are actually thriving and surviving, and this is not a short-lived and arguably rather invasive process to get a very short-lived reprieve and possibly tease the person into thinking this is what your life could have been like, except it's not. If we were cynical, let's say, we would argue that this particular individual is not actually a, let's say, patient, so much as the company responsible for the treatment is using them as very fancy marketing. And that's for a simple reason. Prime Medicine, the company behind this, the biotech company, has said that it will not be developing the therapy any further on its own. In fact, it wants money to do so. Which, unfortunately, is also how life works, but it means that if this person has effectively got a successful treatment, they will be the lucky one and only one to receive it. If somebody else decides, you know what, I will invest in this company, well, others might benefit, but right now it's up in the air and nobody knows what's going to happen. Mostly because biotechnology is ludicrously expensive to develop. Understand, we're not just talking about the basic concept. In order to get this from where it is now to actual approval by, say, the FDA or whatever your local regulatory agency is, it will cost millions, if not possibly billions of dollars to get the necessary approval, and then you have the actual per treatment cost. For example, where there is a sickle cell anemia treatment using gene therapy in the UK, it's also going to cost you about $2 million per dose. And, well, most people would probably think, yeah, I can't afford that, I'm going to have to just live with it. Or possibly die slowly, depending on exactly what the disease is. Next is arguably a reiteration and slight update to an earlier article we spoke about from many weeks ago, talking about where gout comes from and the argument that it's not what we think. Yeah, let's go with that for now. The general argument is that gout is caused by dietary factors, primarily the consumption of large amounts of alcohol and fatty food. The combination of these lead to crystallization of said lipids and similar in your joints, leading to basically tiny little caltrops living inside your joints, and they are really painful because they're pointy and they stab into you every time you move. This is where the research claims that there is a certain amount of DNA evidence that would indicate that it's genetics in part and not necessarily diet that is the cause. We would still argue that in order to get the necessary development, you need the dietary effect. You can't have one without the other. Admittedly, one will facilitate the other, there's no denying that. But we would definitely argue that knowing the genetics are there is nice, if you want to say reduce your alcohol and lipid intake, and therefore reduce the possibility of gout, but it doesn't actually stop it. Next we have that news that says that sitting could be shrinking your brain and that trying to get up and move doesn't help all that much, which we're going to call bullshit on this now, but we're going to call bullshit on it for a very different reason to what you might think. The research from Pittsburgh and Seoul National University is more or less arguing that there is an association between things like Alzheimer's disease and spending more time sitting down. This is all well and good, as it kind of makes sense. Generally speaking, the less active you are, the less likely you are to have any kind of mental activity, let's say. But it's based on a relatively small number of volunteers, 404. The next issue, which is rather more important here, is that it doesn't appear that they've had the necessary adjustment, or at least sampling, across various different socioeconomic stratas, demographic groups, and so on. So basically, they've established an observation, but not necessarily causation, or in more blunt terms, they've got correlation, but not causation. And we take issue with this because, for instance, people who spend more time sitting down tend to be, let's be blunt about this, either much older or, arguably, lower economic status. For example, those who are poorer and therefore don't have the practical ability to go out and, say, go golfing or spend thousands of dollars on a fancy bike to ride on, merely unnecessarily spending that much money, but still. The issue there is quite simply that, depending on who we're talking about, well, it could well be the case that The individuals who are more likely to develop this are the ones who don't have the advantages that the, let's say, more well-off or affluent individuals do. Next we have pandemic-related news and yellow fever. Yellow fever is not something we want spreading, because we basically don't have a major treatment for it. And much like, say, COVID-19, there are options, mostly antivirals, but, well, once you get it, you either survive or you die, and the probability of one or the other is fairly even. Your odds are marginally better if you're in a developed country, but, well, marginally better is only a slight improvement. The reason we're so concerned is fairly straightforward. Not only is it very infectious, but, well, infectious and deadly. So it spreads and it kills, the two things you don't want in a fast-spreading disease. For example, Spanish flu was similar. It was very infectious, but we were fortunate that it was also very deadly, and it basically burnt itself out. COVID-19 was sort of the opposite. Less deadly, although still dangerous, but also highly transmissible. The, let's call it, major approach to solving this has been get rid of mosquitoes, which are the primary mechanism of transmitting it, and this has been done in a variety of different ways. Whether you take the American approach of just spray Agent Orange everywhere and cause cancer instead, or you take a slightly more nuanced approach, such as genetically modifying mosquitoes to be sterile, and therefore kill off the population of mosquitoes. And so we basically have different options. In terms of a people-direct approach, there are vaccines, to an extent, but the vaccines themselves aren't necessarily perfect. The reason for this is simply that, well, yellow fever has not only re-entered the wild population of animals, and also circulated in humans for a long time, it's basically getting a genetic mutation build-up that allows it to circumvent the vaccination regimes that are in place. And in many places, vaccine coverage is just not adequate, which is really not a good sign. This is very much similar to, say, measles, where if you don't have enough coverage, everybody is kind of up shit creek, and there is no paddle to be found at all. The other option, and this is also another major concern, is that in those countries where it's currently endemic, if somebody were to contract yellow fever and travel to another country, mostly Southeast Asia, where there's really no monitoring for it, and while infected get bitten by a mosquito, and then that mosquito carries it to someone else, and basically you get an outbreak from there. The diagnosis and recognition would be slow, as most of those countries don't really deal with yellow fever, ever. They deal with other diseases that have similar signs and symptoms, and therefore it would take a long time to be recognized, and by the time it is, well, it's too late. Next news we have for you is basically more marketing bullshit, but it's marketing bullshit related to an ancient herb that's the fad of the week at the moment. They're similar to, say, green coffee beans or acai berries and so on. It's all bullshit, but it's bullshit that's well sold by different people, such as Gwyneth Paltrow. What it's called is Ashwagandha, and it's been gaining interest because, well, TikTok for the most part. We can blame a lot of the world's bullshit on TikTok, and unfortunately, it doesn't really do what it's claimed to do. The original claim is based more or less on Ayurvedic medicine, which is an ancient Indian, let's say, alternative health practice, which is very similar in many respects to, say, the four humours and similar, where you're trying to balance intangible elements of the human body with the tangible elements, typically symptoms. So, for example, oh, you have too much phlegm? You must be coughing, or vice versa. And the other bullshit will extend from there. Now, it's not to say that Ayurvedic medicine isn't somewhat useful, but understand it is not medicine. It is a natural therapy of sorts. This is where the claims all stem from. Because it has that history in Ayurvedic medicine, Ashwagandha as a root has been used traditionally, and traditional use typically allows for the circumvention of most of the rules around what you can claim something can do, without having properly clinically tested it. It's traditionally used for whatever it is, and therefore it's fine. You're just talking about its history, its cultural value, and so on. The claims that are used most often to sell it are going to be things like improving fitness, fitness here in purely sporting terms, not Viagra type, let's say, functionality, although that is also claimed, so yeah. Treating cancer, hormone issues, improved cognitive function, and the list basically goes on like all of these. Pick a random number of benefits out of a hat and claim they're associated with your given thing. The problem is that most of the research into this found that no, good, quality, longer-term studies that are properly run and don't have definite conflicts of interest seem to show that no, this doesn't actually do what's claimed. As such, yeah, you could certainly take it. It may not do you any harm. There's issues around that too, but for the most part, you won't get any benefits from it. In other, let's say, traditional views, we have research claiming that the reason men are attracted to breasts is not because of sexual arousal, but for a different reason entirely. We would argue that... No, let's not go down that pathway. The study claims that the heterosexual male's attraction to female breasts is all tied into an evolutionary mechanism rather than by culture. And maybe the reason the researchers claim this is that they basically looked into an indigenous population of Papua New Guinea where there's basically no difference in the attraction to breasts, whether they grew up in a time when, women basically wore nothing on their top, and in more recent time when, let's say, a more modest clothing, to use a rather more, let's say, conservative description of it. We would argue that this kind of research is very much limited, especially in its ability to be translated to outside communities where very different cultures and very different standards apply. For example, if you were to ask somebody who works at a strip club what they think of breasts, they'd probably go, yeah, they're nice, but I've seen them. Whereas if you were to ask somebody on the street, they're like, yeah, they're nice, I'd probably kill someone to see them. There's a very big difference in the nature of who we're talking about. The other issue with this is that it is a very small study. It was basically 40 men divided into each group, so 40 who had experienced a generation where toplessness was the norm, and 40 where it wasn't. And they were between, the first group was 17 to 32 years old, the other group was 40 to 70 years old, which again throws in another variable that doesn't appear to have been accounted for very well. In the end, they found that whether or not we're talking about younger people who have, let's say, a more modest environment, or older people who had a more liberal environment, the effect doesn't appear to be substantial. That is, the perception of breasts didn't really change in terms of desirability, whether you were constantly seeing them or whether or not the breasts were covered at all times, they were still considered something that the men wanted to see. Go figure. In other news related to humans and their interesting vices, we have drugs, or psychedelics, but not modern psychedelics. Rather, we are talking about ancient Andean fossils, sort of fossils anyway, that indicate that the use of psychedelics in Peru and similar countries wasn't really dictated by the Incans. Rather, it was something that was just done. Which makes sense because using drugs has basically been the same across the world for most of humanity. Basically, at some point, a caveman, or even prior to the human sort of branch of evolution, we were still finding random weird things on the ground, picking them up and shoving them in our mouth and going, I feel funny now, but I like it. The only difference this research has found that's particularly useful is that where we sort of generalize the idea of humanity going out and finding anything that's going to give them a happy feeling, in this study it appears that only the higher classes of society, the elite or entitled, would have been able to enjoy them, which kind of makes sense. They are the only people who had both the free time and the luxury of being able to have someone make sure they don't do something stupid when high on whatever it is. But what is more useful in this research, we would argue, is the method they used to detect the drugs themselves. They were looking at bone tubes that were used in artifact making. 22 of these were made from bone and 1 from a mollusk. Obviously, that one's not so important unless you're also getting the mollusk stoned at the same time. Bad pun intended. The human bones would indicate that we can actually test them for drugs and have a good idea about what was going on roughly 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. Oh, and we do have to applaud the researchers for choosing to publish this in the publication called PNAS. It is PNAS, but the naming scheme and the choice of topic, perfect. Next we have more current news that's perhaps more useful, and that is, should you take your shower in the morning or the night? And this is something of a debated question. People in the morning will argue that, well, you're already clean, so why would you shower when you're already clean? And those in the night would say, well, why would I want to shower before going to bed, or something similar? And there are various other positions to take. The reason and choice is going to very much depend and vary on who you are and your particular circumstances. The first is, well, why are you showering? For example, if you have low blood pressure, you may want to shower in the morning because it would help to elevate your blood pressure and make you function. It's a very poor substitute for coffee, but it'll get you started. If you want to look at this from a purely hygienic point of view, things are a little more complicated again. And that's because if you shower in the morning, you basically have an entire day's build-up of whatever you've been dealing with. For example, if you've been doing very labor-heavy work, well, you now have sweat, dirt, and whatever else. If you've been working in an office, not so much. As a result, you basically have a body covered in dirt, sweat, and bacteria. In that instance, showering at night makes far more sense because not only will you not be leaving your bed stinking of whatever it is you've been covered in, plus body odor and everything else, you'll also be washing away all these bacteria, which would also cause other issues. Of course, that also does have another fairly major assumption to it, and that is you actually have a clean bed and that you both use a fitted sheet and a flat sheet, and you're not one of those heathens that uses no sheets whatsoever. The conversation does go into greater depth on the benefits and demerits of each option. Next we have what kind of dieting is good for you and whether or not intermittent fasting is actually beneficial. Intermittent fasting is more or less the more modern fad term of, hey look, I'm going to fast for a little while. Not actually doing that every week or every other day or whatever it happens to be, but to an extent imagine something like, say, Ramadan, where you don't eat during sunrise to sunset and then you can eat afterwards or something similar. Lent for Catholics and most Christian denominations to some extent. So this has led to the fad of intermittent fasting, that is where you have 5 days where you eat normally and 2 days where you eat with reduced calories. The catch with this research particularly is that it's a very small group of individuals who are already overweight or obese. Basically, they've chosen the worst possible design to test this because those individuals already have issues around metabolism, primarily effects of the fact that they're overweight or obese. If they had individuals who were, let's say, maintaining a healthy weight and had done so for a reasonable period of time, and then done this study, we'd be sitting here going, yeah, fair enough, their findings are useful. But in this case, we question their findings no matter how promising they may look, simply because the design itself is bad. In the start of animal news this week, we have, well, bird flu cases showing up in cats, and that's not a good sign. Where we have yellow fever in humans, and arguably bird flu in the distant future in humans, right now bird flu is showing up in all kinds of species across, well, continental USA, but also for that matter Hawaii and Alaska. It's just not quite as detailed. And that's a problem, because cats in particular are somewhat more vulnerable to being infected, but they're also another mammalian species, and given that it's successfully infecting one mammal species, cats, the probability of infecting another mammal species, or worse yet, jumping from cat to another mammal species, is high, and especially if it's going to go to humans, who spend a lot of time around their overlords, and we mean cats. So, yeah, this is not good news, and it does get worse, because, at least when it comes to diseases, it can always get worse. Well, it can get worse in regards to everything, but disease particularly. The research is based on publications going back as early as 2004, so there's a lot of publication. That does also make this more akin to a review article than an actual original piece of research, but the summary of the situation is nice to have. When we look at the number of deaths and the nature of them, basically all of them, roughly 90% if not more, come from the most recent H5N1 clade, which is causing all sorts of panic. And so, we have to say, quite bluntly, that yeah, we may well find a situation where bird flu plus yellow fever plus the newest version of COVID all come down on us at the same time like a huge pile of shit. And that's not going to be a fun time. Admittedly, probably more fun than the next news item, only because the poor lab tech that was responsible for it probably has some weird hobbies beyond what they had to do for work. It's shaving roadkill to find out whether or not they glow in the dark. Yeah. Okay, the original research isn't that weird and niche, but somebody's had to do this, which is where it gets weird. The Australian research, unsurprisingly, involved going out and finding roadkill of various mammals for the most part, shaving them and then shining a black light on them to see whether or not they glow. And it's because a weird number of creatures in Australia are weirdly fluorescent when you shine lights on them, particularly fluorescent lights. But not always, it can also be UV lights.
We're back and we're proud. What was that? Fire squirrel.
Why is this? We're not so sure about, but there are various theoretical answers. For example, it's to communicate to other members of the same species. It's to indicate whether or not the animal is, let's say, in heat or similar. And there are a bunch of other possibilities, but Australia, you need to get your shit together because your land tries to kill you, your animals try to kill you, your insects try to kill you, your plants try to kill you, and now you've started finding that they glow in the dark. Your country is kind of messed up, and remembering that somebody had to be sent out to collect roadkill in order to do this. Yeah, probably not in their job description when they were applying, but if it pays the bills. In similar weird glowing news, although this time slightly more useful, it's genetically engineering bacteria so they make both the soil and crops that they are around and with glow, and glow in different colours.
Good evening, Ted. Linda? Ted? Linda? Ted? Linda? I was past the greeting. Ted, don't. We're working with Linda on this very important project, and we are about to light up this rooftop without using a single watt of electricity.
Impossible, you say?
I didn't say anything. It's not! Behold the power of bioluminescence.
Oh, guys, it's so pretty.
We took the plant's DNA and spliced in the bioluminescent properties of fireflies. We call them fire flowers.
Nice work, fellas. I'm impressed.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, I think the company might be interested in something like this.
This might sound like a completely stupid idea. After all, who wants to be eating, say, their loaf of bread and have it suddenly have a blackout and your loaf starts glowing green? Sure, but in terms of its usability in agriculture and in land surveying, conservation and so on, much more useful. The reason for this is mostly kind of straightforward. If you have the various fluorophores involved shine but only under the right circumstances, you can basically go along and, say, have a tractor eradicate anything with flame, spraying herbicides or pesticides on anything it sees that doesn't match the right colour. In other circumstances, if you're taking, say, images on a large scale from an aircraft, you might be able to take a photograph with a very powerful light that's not visible to the naked eye, and know that, okay, this is actually an area that is growing what we want, and this area is not. In other cases, you might want to have it react to certain contaminants in the soil, so it only gets produced when certain things are there that shouldn't be. This will tell you, for example, if there's issues around fracking, for example, or if you have an issue around, say, a runoff from nitrogen or similar. There are all sorts of ways in which this can be applied far more effectively, and more so than ever with the use of, say, low-cost drones, satellite images, automation, and so on. We will admit to having some slight concerns about this, only because of where some of the funding for this came from, United States Department of Defense and the Ministry of Defense in Israel, and we're trying to understand what Israel and the USA are going to use this for in terms of defense. Maybe friend or foe identification, but that seems unlikely. So yeah, that's a little bit worrying. Next we have what is more than anything just a bit of entertaining news, although we do have to wonder why, and it's a simple cartoon trying to, let's say, poke fun at academia in general by hand-drawing a cartoon, which you can see here. And admittedly, it is funny to call us the 50 Shades of Green, so we can't deny it's hilarious, we just worry about the, serious nature of where and what it is. Shifting to the wider environment, we have lightning, and that lightning can spark gamma-ray flashes, or essentially, when you see a lightning strike, there is a small amount of gamma radiation released, which isn't, again, all that surprising, but it is useful to know about. What makes this useful is several-fold. First of all, the fact that gamma radiation can stuff around electricity, admittedly nowhere near as much as a direct lightning strike, but still can do, that we're generating a small amount of radiation, and that we have an association with, specifically, lightning. The research does make us wonder about something, and that's whether or not it was inspired by Godzilla. As we've previously mentioned, Godzilla is not just a walking worldwide threat given the amount of radiation it would have to put out, but theoretically, the energy beams it can fire off could also be achieving something very similar, given the nature of how it fires off the powerful blasts it has. And that owes to the nature of what they describe in this same research. That is the way the energy blast fires forward. It can't just travel as is. Air is a terrible conductor of most energy. It needs to have some sort of leader traveling ahead of it, which allows for it to basically create a path that leads it to its final destination. And typically another kaiju, or any other structure, typically going to be Tokyo Tower. The research looks at exactly how this happens and exactly what's involved, and admittedly, they do need to have very delicate equipment, or at least very sensitive equipment, given that the entire phenomena lasts about 31 microseconds, or roughly 31 millionths of a real second. So this is not exactly long-lasting research. Next we have the weird vibration phenomena that may have explained some of the Iberian Peninsula's electricity problem recently. Mostly it's been affecting Spain and Portugal, although arguably it could be creeping up into southern France depending on how you look at this. And the rolling blackouts could have been caused in part by an issue to do with infrastructure, different energy sources, and different stability issues, one of the major power lines going into southern France basically being cut off for whatever reason, and so on, along with issues to do with the energy being put back into the grid at a different frequency. But there is one more part that could have been, on top of all of this, the cherry on the proverbial shit cake. And it is very simply one thing. There was a rare phenomena called induced atmospheric vibration, and this is possibly a contributing cause, although we doubt very much it's the primary cause. As we mentioned, one of the major power lines, mostly the one going from northern Spain into southern France, experienced issues due to its connectivity, and part of that failure could have been due to the anomalous oscillations. That is the induced atmospheric vibration, which would have caused the power lines to oscillate slightly, and that could have caused synchronization failures between the different electrical systems. This would have only further amplified the already disrupted and disturbed network connecting the Iberian Peninsula into southern France. In other news that the French would find enjoyable, we have lifelike things that could have developed on Earth that much sooner, which means we would have had cheese that much sooner. Okay, bad jokes aside, it is actually the theoretical way that life could have started on Earth much earlier and much more simply than initially thought. And that is, how do you go from, for example, a fairly rudimentary, fairly simple, arguably not particularly difficult to make chemicals, to something as complex as, well, a human being, for instance, or something the size of a blue whale? The research is based on fossilized evidence, so again, take this with a lot of salt, but it does show that life could have begun as far back as 4.2 billion years ago, which is not that long after geologically long after Earth formed, only 250 million years. The research is not necessarily so important for humanity. It does have certain ramifications in terms of our ability to, let's say, explain why and how we came to be, but that's not really the major finding here. There are two big things that are useful. First of all, this evidence basically pushes over the threshold, let's say, of an odds ratio of, well, the biosphere not only being sustainable long enough for humanity to exist, but to allow it to actually happen and therefore be useful. But secondly, it does present some questions around what about other worlds that are Earth-like. And those are a little more complicated, mostly owing to the simple fact that if there are Earth-like planets, do they have the necessary circumstances that we had on our planet to give rise to life? And finally, something that's come back to Earth after a very long life outside of our planet, we have a Soviet probe that spent 53 years lost in space. Well, sort of lost in space. It was meant to go to Venus, it just never got there, because if it did, well, we wouldn't have it back on Earth. The Soviet Venus exploration program had an uncontrolled re-entry back to Earth, well, not that long ago. It was about 15 days, the 10th of May 2025. And that was 53 years after it was launched. You can imagine that, well, something intended to go to Venus was probably going to be pretty resilient. Acid rain, crushing atmospheric pressure, temperatures that are ridiculously wild in fluctuation, and everything else. This is why the roughly a half-ton probe could survive as long as it has. And not only did it survive, but it came back mostly intact. All we need hope now is that although it's returned to Earth, its return hasn't brought back anything particularly exciting, given that the Soviet technology is not just janky, but the entire Soviet world was janky, and what they did in space sometimes is better staying in space. That's all the news we have for you this week, but thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.